we're not going to talk about those today because if you've already been to Paris, you've probably already been to those museums, and or you're tired of the crowds because it can get super crowded in places like the Louvre and Orsay Museums. So instead, there's these awesome alternative museums that you can go visit.
Hello and welcome to the Worldwide Honeymoon Travel Podcast, the podcast that talks about all things couples travel, including destinations, tips, advice, and more. I'm Chris.
I'm Kat.
And this is episode number 219.
Yes, and we are back from Louisville. We just spent this past weekend hanging out in Louisville. We ran the half marathon and marathon. And how was it?
I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, you were a little bit nervous because this is your first marathon back in a long time.
This is both of our first half or full since 2019.
Yeah. And we were doing like 1 1/4 back then.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it was a flat course, which was great. I'm glad we didn't go for a really hilly course. But I know I struggled a little bit, especially because I spent 2 weeks in France, or about 12 days in France beforehand, and I only did 2 runs during that time, so not a lot of training. So I was
you
a
did
little
really
bit
well.
It was a challenge, but I finished. I didn't have to walk, and that was my goal. So
yeah,
there you go.
You did really well.
And you did really well.
Thank you.
Yeah,
it was neat. The big draw for this is that it was on the kickoff day for Derby week. Down in Louisville, and we got to run inside of Churchill Downs. And there were some horses and jockeys practicing on the track as we were running. Is it the infield? Is that where we were? You've been there. I have not.
Yeah, but a long time ago. And I was quite tipsy for it. So, but I was on the infield where you kind of stand and hang out and watch it. But yes, there were horses there. I mean, Churchill Downs is open like in April for horse racing in general. So on the weekends they'll have that. So they did have horses warming up for the morning for that day's races. So that was cool to see the horses warming up and hanging out. But that was definitely the highlight, I think, was running through Churchill Downs.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that was the coolest part of the course. I mean, we did get to run by the Louisville Slugger Museum, which was pretty neat.
We ended up visiting that later.
Yeah.
Which was fun.
It was a solid weekend in Louisville.
Chris tried his first mint julep.
Yeah, I did.
Yeah. So
I cannot remember ever having a mint julep before.
I mean, why would you? Yeah. I'm only sad we didn't get to have Derby pie.
I didn't know that was an option.
It's basically like a chocolate chip pecan cookie pie.
You've made that for me, haven't you?
I feel like I've made it before. It's really good.
I enjoyed it.
Yeah. All right. So speaking of returning back from France, I spent 4 days in Champagne, which I will definitely talk about in future episodes. But I spent a whole week in Paris, and a lot of the purpose of spending a whole week in Paris was, well, I wanted to. I think that would be fun, first and foremost. But having France Voyager, my second blog just about France, I have an article about the Paris Olympics coming up next year. Tickets are going to start going out, or tickets are going to be released soon for the single ticket sales. So yeah, I wanted to go to Paris and check out what are some of the smaller museums and other things to do in Paris to sort of help write about it, create content around it, but also get ready for the Paris Olympics next year. So I will be writing about some of that stuff later on France Voyager. But since I did get to spend some of that time in Paris exploring the smaller museums and doing some more hidden gem fun things, this episode I'm going to talk about the smaller museums to visit in Paris. And a couple of them you've been to, so you can kind of talk about them.
Sure.
But I have 13 museums here that are well worth going to in Paris that are not the Louvre, they're not d'Orsay, and those are probably the 2 most prominent museums. Nothing wrong with them. If you've never been to Paris before, certainly must visit. I actually recommend, if you're going to go to the Louvre, I did a tour there this past time, and I really recommend that. I did a tour with Walks Tours, or the Take Walks group. They have a tour that goes on Friday nights. So it's when it's from 6:45 to 9:45, and so the Louvre is open later that night, And I believe they have one too in the afternoons on Saturday. But the one at Friday night is really, really great because it's less crowded during that time. And then you get to see the Mona Lisa at her most peaceful as they're about to start kicking people out of the museum for the evening. So there's no line for it. You can kind of go right up and see her. So that's really exciting. But it's also an art history person who guides the tour. So they have lots and lots of fun facts and show you sort of the highlights of the Louvre while you're there. So if that's your first time, you don't want to be overwhelmed by all of the art that you're seeing and you want a little more context, I actually highly recommend going on a guided tour for the Louvre. But aside from the Louvre, which is known for quite a bit of art up until, I can't remember what the year cutoff was, but then the remainder of that art, I think sometime in the like 1800s, 1700s, then the art starts being in the D'Orsay Museum, which that's where you're going to see some of the Impressionists, the Post-Impressionists, stuff like that. So those are the two biggest museums and the most visited museums that you're probably going to see in Paris. But we're not going to talk about those today because if you've already been to Paris, you've probably already been to those museums, and or you're tired of the crowds because it can get super crowded in places like the Louvre and D'Orsay museums. So instead, there's these awesome alternative museums that you can go visit that have art, history, different things like that I highly recommend visiting while in Paris. So without further ado, let's jump into the 13 best smaller museums to visit in Paris. The first museum you've been to, Christopher, so you can talk about it as well. This is the Rodin Museum.
I really enjoyed this museum.
This is great. So Rodin, he was part of the Impressionists. It was most famous for being a sculptor. And so this museum is actually, it's super gorgeous. It's in the 7th arrondissement of Paris. And it has both an indoor and outdoor component to it. So the interior is just this beautiful sort of home and lots of rooms with tons of beautiful iconic sculptures. And then you go outside and it's a sculpture garden. And so there's lots of beautiful flowers. There's a little fountain with ducks in it, and then sculptures everywhere and roses and things. Most iconically, the Thinker is going to be the biggest sculpture you're going to see from Rodin that'll be in that garden.
Yes, and the gardens were gorgeous.
Yeah, I know there were roses, there were hydrangeas.
Yeah, there were nice little water features and fountains. Mm-hmm. And if you go all the way back to the furthest point in the rear of the gardens, there's just a beautiful perspective view of the gardens themselves and then the museum in the background there. But really, really interesting museum.
Yeah, so that, and it's right in the middle of Paris, 7th arrondissement, but it feels like a little oasis, especially with the gardens there. So first museum to go check out in Paris. The second one is starting to get more and more popular. It is one of my favorite museums to visit, especially if you are a fan of the Impressionists and Post-Impressionists, and that is the Musée de l'Orangerie. And this is most famous for its water lily paintings. Monet designed the rooms that they were going to be in himself so that the gigantic water lily paintings would be on display as best as they possibly could be. So this museum, and it's not just the water lilies, but it is most famous for it. You walk into this museum, there's this open room that's circular that you kind of go in. It's almost to sort of prepare you to see the water lilies. And then you go into two separate rooms, and on each of the four walls, and they're circular rooms, they have gigantic paintings of times of day, times of year, different things like that, of the water lilies. So you get to see them from different perspectives, times of day, different things like that. So really, really beautiful. And then there's the collection of Jean Walter and Paul Guillaume, with many of the Impressionist, Post-Impressionist paintings in the basement. So upstairs, you're going to see the Monet paintings. Then you can head downstairs and see some of their permanent collection, which includes stuff from Picasso. It includes things from, just lots of other big name artists of that time. So really, really cool. Highly recommend it. And then they also have, usually have a temporary exhibit that's pretty cool too. I've seen some where it's photography, other types of paintings, really cool stuff like that. So always worth checking out. It maybe takes an hour or so to see. So it's a smaller museum that if you don't want to go to the D'Orsay or the Louvre and you want to see some of the typical like French art from like, the Impressionist, post-Impressionist era. The Orangerie Museum is right there, and it's also on the other side of the Tuileries Gardens from the Louvre. So you could go see the Louvre and then just walk along the Tuileries to the Orangerie Museum. And it's fantastic.
Yeah, the water lily works alone are worth a visit.
Yes.
I mean, just words can't really describe the feeling when you're there and you're surrounded by them, and you can really truly appreciate the art.
Yeah, and you'll definitely see Monet pieces in the d'Orsay Museum and stuff, but to really get the full experience of it, definitely going to the Orangerie Museum is fantastic. It's in the first arrondissement. Like I said, it's on the other side of the Tuileries Gardens from the Louvre. So very easy to get to. It's sort of in that central part. So a little bit more popular than some of these other museums that I've talked about, but definitely nowhere near as crazy as the Louvre or d'Orsay and things like that. Museum number 3 is one that I just visited this most recent time, and that is the Picasso Museum. So the National Picasso Museum in Paris. That is in the Le Marais area of Paris. Really cool area. There's lots of cool museums and shops and things in that area, but the Museum of Picasso has tons of stuff about his life and his work. He was a Cubism and Surrealism artist. He has sketches, there's paintings, there's sculptures. The man seemed to have done it all. They even had like a little display about the Breton, like the blue and white little striped shirts and things like that on display there. But really, really cool. Highly recommend checking that out. It doesn't take too long to explore that as well, maybe an hour and a half or so. And then they also have temporary exhibits at this museum. When I went, and I believe this is going until early July, they have the Black is Beautiful exhibit by Faith Ringgold, and she does a lot of kind of Cubism sort of paintings as well, and then adds in there'll be different women, Black women in history, and different things like that, and randomly a Van Gogh sort of in the background of a painting or a quilt. I've seen a few of those in her works, but highly, highly worth checking out the Picasso Museum in the Le Marais area of Paris. Number 4, and this is definitely a hidden gem, definitely worth it though, is the Museum of Fairground Arts, and it's all the way out in Bercy in the 12th arrondissement.
This one sounded so incredible. I was so jealous that you got to go. This is one that is probably at the top of my list for when we go back.
Yes.
Assuming my French progresses.
Yes, and the reason why he says that is because the only way to see this museum, because people can rent it for private events and things, is you have to buy your ticket in advance for a tour, and the tours are in French. So if you're learning French, it's a great way to continue to learn that. That's what I did. I was very proud of myself. I could understand most of it. But so you do kind of have that complication about it if you are like an English speaker, not a French speaker, going and trying to visit it. But fantastic when you get to visit. While I did go, I was the only adult without a child with me. It was such a cool museum that I feel like it's sort of for anyone. It is basically showing fairground games and rides from the Belle Epoque era, so sort of the end of the 1800s, that sort of time frame. Very, very cool. They have like dancing displays and music displays. And then you have lots of carousels you can ride on. There's some cool games. It's just a ton of fun and very interactive. And the fact that you get to ride on these old fair rides is just really epic. It was such a fun museum. I had it in my Instagram stories when I went. Really, really cool. And I highly recommend it. And it is a little bit further out, so you're going to get a lot more locals. Obviously, they don't offer tours in English, so it's definitely not like a very touristy place, but highly, highly worth going, especially if you speak a little bit of French. And that sort of thing. Number 5 is the Gustave Moreau Museum, and this was just around the corner from where I stayed this last time in Paris, so I figured why not stop in. It is in the 9th arrondissement, so in Pigalle, so closer to the Montmartre area, and you're basically going into the artist home and studio of Gustave Moreau, who was a symbolist artist, and it's fantastic. The first floor that you're going into and checking out is his home, and then you go upstairs to the studio, and it's 2 floors of just tons of cool paintings, floor to ceiling almost, of his work, and it's absolutely stunning. It's also known as like an Instagrammy spot too, with the big spiral staircase that goes up. Really cool destination regardless. It's just an epic looking studio as well as house, so pretty cool. Number 6, I've been here a couple of times. It's also in the 9th arrondissement in Pigalle, the Musée de la Vie Romantique, so the Museum of the Romantic Life. And it was once the base, so it was kind of a hotel and stuff, and then it was the base of Ari Scheffer, who was a Dutch artist. But many artists met there. He hosted a lot of events with his daughter, hosting people like George Sand and different things like that. So many artists and writers and things met there. But it has a lot of work from the people that hung out there, essentially. So lots of paintings and sculptures and art or things like artifacts and things like that. It also has a very pretty tea room next to it. So if you want to grab tea and a pastry or something during the day while you're there, that's a great place for it too. All right. Next up, number 7. I feel like I'm going through
This is like rapid fire.
Rapid fire museums in Paris. So number 7 is the Maison Victor Hugo. And this is in a cool little spot because I happened upon this one because I went to Place de Vauzage. And that's where Carrette was or is. There's a couple places where this Carrette cafe is. And I stopped and got breakfast there one morning. Got a little like Mont Blanc pastry and a pain au chocolat and a hot chocolate, which turned out to be my favorite hot chocolate in Paris because I tried to compare some of the bigger ones this last time. And while I love Les Domagots and I think it's such a great location and the hot chocolate is amazing, Carrette, I think, just has them beat by a little bit. So you're going to have to try it next time, Christopher.
Lies.
I know. But after that, there's a little park next to Carrette, and then you kind of go to the other side of the park, and you can go to Victor Hugo's house. It is where the author had lived. He is the author most famous for Les Mis, for The Hunchback of Notre Dame, different things like that. But it is in the 4th arrondissement in the Le Marais area as well. So well worth checking out. If you're noticing a theme, it seems like Pigalle and the Le Marais area tend to have quite a few great museums to go and check out. Number 8 isn't so much a museum per se, but it is sort of a mausoleum, sort of memorial place for a lot of famous people, French people that have passed on. So that is the Pantheon. And I guess when I first went there, I sort of expected it to be sort of like the Pantheon in Rome, right? Like you were there with me last summer. It has the big hole in the top, and it's an old Greek or Roman, I guess, temple that was converted into a church, correct?
Yeah.
In Rome. And I was like, oh, it's probably going to be something similar. This is not. This was built in like the 1700s and did become a mausoleum / a memorial place for a lot of famous French people, whether they were artists or they even have a memorial for people that have died in the wars and stuff like that. But definitely worth going to see. The upstairs or the main floor has lots of like paintings and different things. And then you go downstairs to the basement, and that's where you can see some of the people buried there, including both the Curies.
Madame Curie?
Yes. But then you can also go to the rooftop, and I think it's €3 to go to the roof. And it's really cool because once you climb up there, it has 360-degree views of the city. So this is sort of a hidden gem place to see the Eiffel Tower and a viewpoint of the city that a lot of people don't think about. I mean, there's the Arc de Triomphe, there's, going to the top of the Montmartre, some rooftop bars and things, but the Pantheon is a great place. I got to see the Notre Dame, Arc de Triomphe, all this cool stuff just walking around the top part of the Pantheon and the Eiffel Tower, like a really good view of that. So really highly recommend going and visiting the Pantheon while you're in Paris. And that is in the 5th arrondissement, so kind of closer to the Saint-Germain Latin Quarter area. So cool place. Number 9 on this list is going to be Eugene Delacroix Museum, the Eugene Delacroix Museum. So he is most famous. He's a romantic artist, most famous for painting Liberty Leading the People. I don't know if you can picture that in your head.
I cannot.
It's a famous piece in the Louvre. And it's literally this woman who has her top, she's holding the French flag and, she's topless for whatever reason. And she's
Lady Liberty?
She's leading the French people. And so I also learned during just a little segue. I also learned doing the Louvre tour with the art history person. She was like, so the only reason you could see women could be topless in these paintings was if they were a goddess, an allegory for something, such as liberty leading the people, or like a nymph. They're considered like a forest nymph or something like that. They could not be like a real woman that was just topless. So that's how they did it. And why did they do it? Well, men have always been the same. And that sells. I don't know. So they were like, why do you have this topless woman leading these people? And they're like, oh, no, it's liberty leading the people. The allegorical, liberty. But anyway, he's well known for that. But he has his own museum tucked away in the 6th arrondissement, and it truly is tucked away. I sort of also stumbled upon this at one point, and it's 2 buildings, and the first is kind of his house area that has works that he's done and sketches and paintings and things, and then you go outside, and there's this beautiful, peaceful garden. Again, it feels like a tucked away thing in the middle of Paris, and then you go into his studio, which has also lots of art and things like that. So really, really cool museum. And it was kind of neat because I went the following day after going to the Louvre. So I was like, oh, that name sounds familiar. And then I was like, oh, it's the person who painted the famous Liberty Leading the People painting. So pretty cool. The next museum I'm going to point out, I think this is number 10. You've also been here. I've been here once, and that was the time that we went. And this is the museum, the Montmartre Museum.
I really liked this museum a lot.
Yeah, so it's in the 18th, so it's in Montmartre. It was home to many famous artists and painters, including Renoir. And so basically this museum has the history of the neighborhood, including its cabarets, La Bohème, all of the things that have sort of happened, because it used to be a very different area than it is today, but it's still very romantic and charming, or it's very romantic and charming today. But the museum sort of outlines all of that history, the artists and the painters and lots of people that were that lived there, but also were a part of that neighborhood. And then there's also Renoir's gardens that you can go and stroll through, which are stunning, as well as the Montmartre Vineyard that is right next to the museum. And it's known as having the most expensive, disgusting wine in Paris, because they say the wine's not very good. We didn't try it. We just saw the vineyard. But I believe it's the only the only vineyard in Paris. So, yeah. Any thoughts about the Montmartre Museum?
This was the one, it was a small house almost, right?
Yes, because Renoir lived there.
Yes. It was very homey,
Mm-hmm.
very intimate, which was neat. It felt like walking through someone's home, like the home of an art collector, right? So it was not as, I'll say, intimidating as maybe like a traditional art museum is. It was just very cozy.
Yeah, and I will say that I believe they had his apartment, like studio area too, didn't they? Or they had some studio in the middle of museums. Really cool to see. Number 11 is probably one of my favorite museums, and it's in the 5th arrondissement, and it's the Cluny Museum, which is actually the Museum of the Middle Ages. I thought this was so, so cool. It is located in a former abbey, and before that, it was an actual Roman bathhouse, and the Cluny Museum is really, really cool. It has lots of artifacts depicting the lives, especially of the wealthy during the Middle Ages and the developments that were occurring at that time. Art from the Middle Ages, especially stuff from different churches and things like that. But yeah, I think it's really cool to show because, we think of the Middle Ages, the Dark Ages, and that's such a misconception because a lot was happening during that time frame. I think it goes from like the 900s or the 1000s until maybe the 1500s, 1600s. I forget exactly, but that's a long stretch of time with a lot of art and a lot of life and inventions and things happening. So that's cool to see. And it's most famous for the tapestries of the Lady and the Unicorn. And so there's 6 tapestries. 5 of them depict the 5 senses. And then you have one that's My Greatest Desire, and it's her emerging from this tent looking glamorous, and she has a lion on one side of her and a unicorn on the other, and her little like maid servant and stuff. But they're huge tapestries. They're very famous from, I can't remember, I think they were from the 1500s. Definitely worth going to see, but the whole museum is really cool, and it is it's just a really cool place to check out. And then in the basement of the museum, you actually get to see ruins of the former bathhouse that was there from the Roman times. And then they have some artifacts that they found around the city there as well. But
that's really cool.
Yeah, some Roman artifacts. Because, yeah, I mean, I mean, a long time ago, Paris has been inhabited for a long, long, long time. I mean, you had the Gauls, the Romans, all sorts of things. So the Cluny Museum is a great way to learn a little bit more about the Middle Ages in Europe, and even see an old Roman bathhouse in the ruins of that. So pretty cool. Number 12 is the Carnavalet Museum, and this is the history of Paris. And it's in 2 neighboring mansions in the 3rd arrondissement. And it just goes over the history of the city because, again, like I said, it's been inhabited for a very, very, very long time. So it goes from prehistoric times to the Gauls, to the Gallo-Romans, the Middle Ages, the French Revolution, Napoleon, the Romantic period, the Belle Epoque, the Lost Generation. So it even talks about, the writers and the artists and the painters that moved there during that time, all the way up until today. So it's highly worth going to go visit. It's also a pretty interactive museum, and it sort of talks about how, just all the little bits of history there through art, artifacts, all sorts of different things. So it's really, really cool to check out. I highly, highly recommend going to the Carnavalet Museum. And then the last museum that I'm going to point out here is the Petit Palais Museum, and that's in the 8th arrondissement, and it is just the Museum of Fine Arts. So a lot of cities in Paris, or France, have a fine arts museum, and that is where this is. So it's a beautiful museum. It's easy to go to, and it has anything from antiquity to the 20th century. So if you don't want to go to the Louvre, but you're interested in going to a fine arts museum, this is a fantastic one to go to. It has paintings, sculptures, tapestries, etc. So just like any other fine arts museum. And it even has a beautiful courtyard in the middle, which is really lovely. So those are my 13 museums to go and visit. I do want to shout out a couple that I didn't get to visit this time around. I think 59 Rivoli, the National Archives. There's a lot of other great museums to go and visit in Paris that I haven't even seen yet, after spending a week there on top of all the other times I've visited in Paris. But these are some of the great smaller ones that you can certainly go to during your time.
Yeah, and as someone who has been to Paris but has not been to either the Louvre or d'Orsay.
Oh, you haven't? That's right.
Right. Don't sleep on the smaller museums.
I had so much fun at the smaller museums. Particularly, I loved the Cluny Museum. I thought that was amazing. And I would say the Picasso Museum was amazing. The Gustave Moreau. It's hard to really say, which one's the best, but I don't know. I feel like the Cluny Museum may have been the best. That was really cool. Just the Middle Ages Museum in the middle of the city. So
you kind of preempted my question there, but I was going to ask you, do you have a favorite out of the ones that you just listed?
I know. I did kind of talk about that. Oh, they're so different. I would say the most quirky is going to be the Museum of Fairground Arts. I think the best art museum is Musée de l'Orangerie. I think it's got a good combination of Impressionist, Post-Impressionist, plus the Monet's water lilies. I feel like it's better than the d'Orsay Museum personally, but that's just my opinion. So Orangerie. And then for a history museum, hands down, the Cluny Museum was really, really cool.
Nice.
Yeah.
This is more of a logistics question, but is there like a museum pass that will get you into like a bunch of these, or do you know what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, I mean, the Paris Pass has a lot of stuff.
Okay.
But that includes like the Louvre, a river cruise. It may include the hop-on, hop-off bus. I feel like it's more of the bigger things. Some of these are very cheap or even free. I think the Victor Hugo House is free. Petit Palais is free. If you wanted to do the National Archives, that's free. Or they're very inexpensive.
Cool.
So, yeah.
And then my last question for you. Which of these museums were you in, enjoying the art, and you were like, this is Paris?
Ooh, okay. I would say the Gustave Moreau Museum. I feel like it feels like you're like, I don't know, it feels like you're kind of taken back in time.
Okay.
Which is cool, but and the Rodin Museum. I feel like that one definitely feels like, oh, you're in Paris. It's very beautiful, but it's calm. So you're in a place in Paris that's not crazy busy, which is lovely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah, that's those are the highlights of some of the smaller museums to visit when you're in Paris, guys. I would love to know your thoughts. What are your favorite museums to go to in Paris? I have tons of Paris content I'm sure I could talk about later on in a different podcast episode, but let us know your thoughts. You can always reach us on Twitter, WWHoneymoon, Instagram at Worldwide Honeymoon, or email kat@worldwidehoneymoon.com. But thank you guys so much for tuning in.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks for tuning in, and don't forget to rate and review our podcast. It takes less than a few minutes and really helps other people find us. Also, if you're enjoying this awesome free information on both the blog and podcast, when you're booking your next trip, head over to worldwidehoneymoon.com/resources and use the links provided. We earn a small commission at no cost to you when you book through these links, and these are all brands and companies we know, love, and use, like Skyscanner for finding the best flight prices, World Nomads for the best travel insurance, TripAdvisor for hotel bookings and reviews, and even Amazon for all of your travel purchases.
Thank you for tuning in. We really appreciate it. Wherever you are, wherever you go, remember to make every day a worldwide honeymoon.